Isn't it crazy that at the Seneca Falls Women's Convention, the women themselves voted against campaigning for the right to vote? It was only when Frederick Douglass took the stand and made an electrifying speech convincing women that they had a right to a voice in their own democracy that women decided to fight for suffrage. Keep Douglass in mind, because we'll come back to him later. In the meantime, imagine an 18-year-old named Charlotte Woodward who was in the audience at Seneca Falls during those 2 days of the convention, listening to Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton speak. Charlotte had heard about the convention through a flyer that had been passed around her neighborhood, and as soon as the convention was over, she joined the American Women's Suffrage Association, and she fought for women's right to vote throughout her 20s, and her 30s, and her 40s, and her 50s, and her 60s, and her 70s, and her 80s. Finally, in 1920, the United States passed the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women the right to vote across the country. Charlotte was 92 years old, and she was the only surviving member of the Seneca Falls Convention who lived to see that day. 1920. In 1920, my great-grandpa was 16 years old. I knew my great-grandpa well all through my childhood. He made root beer floats and he gave me boxes of Cracker Jacks. That guy that I knew was 16 years old before women got the right to vote. I do want to point out that my great-grandpa's mom could vote before 1920 because they lived in Utah, and Western states had been granting and revoking women's right to vote for decades. Because of this back and forth, and also because many Eastern states were dead set against women's suffrage, American women decided that they needed an amendment to the Constitution that guaranteed that women could vote everywhere, not just in some states. So, what took so long? And how did the women make it happen? Did they work together, making sure that all women were included? Let's answer these questions with a blitz through time, from the Seneca Falls Convention to the passage of the 19th Amendment. (1848), the Seneca Falls Women's Convention. People make an action plan to start dismantling the patriarchal system. 1850, the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Lucy Stone, Sojourner Truth, they're all in attendance. Remember that the women's movement had grown directly out of the movement to abolish slavery, so all of these people were fighting for racial equity as well as gender equity. 1861 to 1865, the Civil War. During the Civil War, efforts for the suffrage movement come to a halt. People put their energy toward abolition and toward winning the war. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery is officially outlawed, but there is a long way to go for equal rights for African American citizens, including the right to vote. 1866, the war is over, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the American Equal Rights Association, an organization with the stated goal of equal rights for everyone, regardless of gender or race. But 1869, after just 3 years, the American Equal Rights Association is torn apart by disagreements about the 15th Amendment, which would only allow Black American men to vote. It's easy to say equal rights for all, regardless of gender or race. But when it comes down to one group of people's rights being prioritized over another group's rights, people can start to feel a sense of scarcity and panic that they're not going to have their needs met. On one side were Frederick Douglass and Lucy Stone, who supported the 15th Amendment. They argued that it was the, quote, Negro's hour, and that Black male voting rights should come first. And after those were secured, then they could push for a separate amendment for women's suffrage. On the other hand were Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who argued that any constitutional amendment that granted suffrage without including women was unacceptable. It was at this point that the stress of scarcity started to show. and things got ugly. They argued that if anyone should get the vote first, it should be educated white women. Stanton in particular argued that African Americans were ignorant of the laws and political systems in the United States. She said, "It is a serious question whether we ought to stand aside and let Sambo enter the kingdom first." Sambo is a racist term for people of color, and it was racist then. Then Susan B. Anthony piled on. "If you will not give suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. If intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence in the government, let the question of women be brought up first, and that of the Negro last. Mr. Douglas talks about the wrongs of the Negro, but with all the outrages that he today suffers, he would not exchange his sex and take the place of Elizabeth Cady Stanton." Meaning, a black man who had escaped enslavement had it easier than a rich white woman. To this, Frederick Douglass responded, "I do not see how anyone can pretend that there is the same urgency in giving the ballot to woman as to the Negro. With us, the question is a matter of life and death. When women, because they are women, are hunted down to the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have the urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own." This conflict created a painful rift between the activists who, up until this point, had been very close friends. Remember Frederick Douglass rallying for these women at Seneca Falls? But none of them thought that they could win the right to vote for black men and white women at the same time. Meanwhile, Sojourner Truth pointed out, "There is a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women." Truth and other black women were in many ways left out of both groups, and they rejected the notion that people needed to choose one or the other. They campaigned for universal suffrage and wanted an amendment that addressed everyone's needs at the same time. So, in answer to our question, did women work together to guarantee suffrage for everyone? Some of them did, but the white women with the most visibility and power did not. And that betrayal contributed to a growing problem of white feminism that persists to this day. Back to the timeline. 1872. Susan B. Anthony goes to the polls and casts a vote in the presidential election. She's immediately arrested and brought to trial in Rochester, New York. 15 other women are arrested for illegally voting. Sojourner Truth tries to cast a ballot, but is turned away and sent home. 1878, a woman's suffrage amendment is proposed to Congress. It is rejected. An amendment is proposed every single year for the next 42 years and is rejected every single time. 1894. Suffragists bring 600,000 signatures to the New York State Constitutional Convention in an effort to bring a women's suffrage amendment to the voters. It is rejected and laughed at. But think about it. Women are out in the street gathering those signatures. They're presenting the signatures at political events. Women are mobilizing in the public sphere. 1896. A contingent of Southern white men make the case that white women should be allowed to vote, specifically in order to enact white supremacist laws. Meanwhile, Ida B. Wells Barnett had been campaigning for black rights, specifically against lynching. She was also working for women's suffrage and helped to found the National Association for Colored Women's Clubs, claiming that women could accomplish the reforms that the pulpit and the law had failed to do. 1911, the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage is organized. So let's pause here and talk about some of the arguments against women's suffrage. First of all, the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage was led by a woman. Her name was Josephine Jewel Dodge, and she claimed, "The life of the average woman is not so ordered as to give her first-hand knowledge of those things which are essentials of sound government. She is worthily employed in other departments of life, and the vote will not help her fulfill her obligations therein." So here we see a major argument that is still used by people who oppose gender equity. And you know what? I'm going to shock you and say that I think we should take her argument seriously. First, women didn't have first-hand knowledge of government. How could they when they weren't allowed to study or participate in government? This is a classic circular argument. Women and other marginalized groups were not allowed to acquire certain skills, so they didn't have those skills, so they were assumed to be innately inferior at those skills, so they were not allowed to participate to acquire those skills. But let's try to see from her point of view. Women had no experience in politics, and it would have been near impossible to imagine women doing something that they had never ever done before. Second, she says that women are worthily employed in other departments of life, which of course means taking care of children and running the household. And you know what? That was true. Historically, the work of raising children was women's work. And when she says they were worthily employed in that work, my hot take is that that's also true. Care work is critically important, and it's noble work. And speaking as a mom of 4 myself, it can also be really, really joyful. What she's wrong about is thinking that women are the only ones who can do that essential care work. It turns out that dads are really great parents and really great partners in running a household. And if women could vote, then they could have a say in things that impacted their own lives and their children's lives, and they could function as fully realized adults alongside their adult spouses. Does this discussion still have resonance today? Anyway, even though the anti-women's suffrage movement was led by a woman, the movement was mostly men. And it's really interesting to look at anti-women's suffrage propaganda from the time to get inside their heads. It seems to me that men were scared of losing their place. They'd been taught that their value was in their masculinity, and that their masculinity depended upon their having power over women. A few powerful institutions also opposed women's suffrage. Not surprisingly, some religious institutions actively lobbied against it, but also the liquor lobby. Many women at the time were involved in the temperance movement, which sought to prohibit the consumption of alcohol. So one of the strongest opponents to women's enfranchisement was the liquor lobby, who was afraid that women would use their vote to prohibit the sale of liquor, which they totally did. 1912. Women's suffrage is supported for the first time at the national level by a major political party, Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. But Theodore Roosevelt was beaten in 1912 by Woodrow Wilson, who at the time did not support women's suffrage. So, in 1913, on the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration, suffragists organized a massive parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Thousands of women marched along Pennsylvania Avenue, iconically led by Inez Mulholland on a white horse, meant to evoke Joan of Arc. Alice Paul and the National American Women's Suffrage Association chose a very direct motto for the parade, which they called the Great Demand. We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States enfranchising the women of this country. The parade is remembered as an iconic moment in the women's suffrage movement, but I want to zoom in on 2 lesser-known facts. First, the planners of the parade envisioned a highly organized and very dignified display of women's competence. But once they got there, the women found themselves surrounded by hordes of men who were yelling insults at them, spitting at them, sexually harassing and manhandling them. The women reported that they received no assistance from nearby police officers who sat there shaking their heads like, well, you wouldn't be in this predicament if you had just stayed home. Many women were crying and some turned back, but most of them stayed and faced the ambush using banner poles and flag poles and hat pins to ward off the men's attacks. Finally, about an hour later, the U.S. Army showed up to clear the streets so that the women could proceed with the parade. Second, Black women felt like they were under attack long before the hostile men showed up. For example, famous journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett, who had been working in the women's movement for years, traveled from Illinois to Washington, D.C., of course expecting to march with the Illinois delegation. Christian, thank you so much for being here. I'm wondering if you can tell us the story of Ida B. Wells at the Women's Parade in Washington in 1913.
Thank you for having me here, Amy. So the story of Ida B. Wells Barnett is such an important story. She was a famous journalist who had been working in the women's movement for years, and she had traveled to Washington, D.C., and of course, fully expecting to march with them because she had committed so much time and work for this women's movement. But at the planning meeting, right before the parade started, the white suffrage leaders announced at the parade that she would be segregated and the women of color would have to march at the back. And just imagining that all the work she had done in that position, that she would be segregated. A Black newspaper who covered the story at the time, it said, Wells Barnett vowed that she would march with them or not at all, and left the room. When the women began marching, Ida was nowhere to be seen, but then she suddenly appeared to calmly take her place with the Illinois delegation. Two white suffragists, Belle Square and Virginia Brooks, took positions on each side of her, showing solidarity, showing that no color line existed. This story is so important, Amy. It shows the importance of solidarity. It shows the importance of standing your ground and staying committed to our values. I think this is such a powerful story.
Thank you so much. This story is so important for white women. Who are we going to be in our communities, in our dot on the historical timeline? The white women who only care about our own liberation and actively oppress others? The white women who see that happening but do nothing? Or the white women who stand on either side of our sisters of color while they claim their place? Just something to think about. 1915. Alice Paul, leader of the National Women's Party, brings attention-grabbing protest tactics from British suffragists to the United States. In 1917, 10 suffragists who are picketing the White House are arrested and charged with obstructing sidewalk traffic. 1919, the suffrage movement had finally gained enough support, and the 19th Amendment passes both the House and the Senate. 1920, the states ratify the 19th Amendment, finally granting women the right to vote. The amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." This is an incredible achievement, and celebrations erupt all over the country. But not all women benefited from the 19th Amendment. Native American women couldn't vote because Native Americans were not yet recognized as citizens of the United States. Asian Americans couldn't vote, and Black Americans experienced such intense voter suppression that the 15th and the 19th Amendments in some parts of the country were practically meaningless. We'll learn more about their experiences on future episodes. But as we wrap up today, check out this global map that shows when women all over the world secured the right to vote. Then tell me what you learned below in the comments.